The night Benjamin Keating rode into Caldwell, Kansas, the summer of 1882, the saloon doors were swinging with the kind of news that made a good man's blood run cold. He had been 3 days on the trail coming up from the Cherokee Strip, his chestnut mare Rosalind caked in red dust, his canteen running low, his belly empty save for the half-hardened biscuit he had gnawed somewhere around midday. He had intended to stop only long enough to water the horse, fill the canteen, and perhaps sit down to a plate of something warm before pressing on toward Wichita, where a cattle outfit called the Double Arrow was expecting him by the end of the week. Benjamin Keating was a working cowboy, and he had always been punctual about his obligations. That was the kind of man he was. Tall, lean as fence wire, with sun-darkened skin and a jaw that had seen more than its share of hard weather. He was 28 years old and had spent the better part of a decade driving cattle, mending fence, sleeping under open sky, and asking nothing from the world except a fair day's wage for honest work. He tied Rosalind at the rail outside the Silver Fork Saloon, told her quietly that she had done beautifully today, and went inside. The place was crowded for a Tuesday evening. A piano player worked through something vaguely resembling a waltz in the corner, and the smell of tobacco and boiled beef thickened the air. Benjamin settled at the bar, ordered coffee and a plate of whatever was hot, and loosened the bandana from his neck while he waited. That was when he heard the name. Two men at the far end of the bar were deep in conversation, their voices carrying through the din, with the particular self-satisfied volume of men who believed no one around them was paying any attention. The taller one, a red-faced fellow in a vest with brass buttons, was talking to a shorter man whose hat brim flopped down over his ears like he had borrowed it from somebody larger. "Hadley woman is done for," the tall one said, reaching for his glass. "Colton's already sent word to the land office. She has got maybe 2 weeks before those papers go through." Benjamin did not look up. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most useful thing a man could do was appear to be entirely uninterested. "She's still refusing to sell?" the shorter one asked. "Refusing is putting it mildly. She told Colton to go straight to the devil when he sent his man out there last Thursday. Said that land belonged to her family and she would not sign anything." The tall one laughed, and it was not a kind sound. "She is out there alone on 300 acres with no husband, no hired men, nothing but a rifle she probably cannot even lift. Colton has already gotten the county assessor in his pocket. It is just a matter of time." "That is a shame," the shorter man said without much conviction. "Fine piece of land out along the Cimarron. It will be a fine piece of land when Colton gets it. He is putting a rail spur through, bought up half the properties between here and Medicine Lodge already. The Hadley place is the last piece he needs." Benjamin stirred his coffee when it arrived, and he ate his meal slowly and deliberately, and he did not say a single word to the two men at the end of the bar. But a picture had formed itself in his mind without permission, the way certain pictures did when something in a man's conscience refused to let an injustice slide past without being seen. He thought about a woman alone on 300 acres along the Cimarron. He thought about a land office filing and a crooked county assessor, and a man named Colton who had apparently already purchased whatever authorities stood between him and what he wanted. He left a coin on the bar and walked back outside into the warm July evening. Rosalind turned her head to look at him. "I know," he said to her. "I know." He stood there for a long moment looking up at the stars, which were coming out thick and brilliant above the flat Kansas plain. He thought about the Double Arrow outfit waiting on him in Wichita. He thought about the pay that was owed him and the bunk he had been promised and the autumn drive north that he had been counting on. Then he went back inside the saloon and asked the barman if he knew where the Hadley property was located. The barman, a square-built man with a gray mustache, gave him a measured look. "About 14 miles southwest. You follow the main road out past Ira Fletcher's mill, then cut south when you hit the fork with the old cottonwood that got split by lightning. Stay along the creek bed and you will see the house up on the low rise." He paused. "You ain't working for Colton, are you?" "No," Benjamin said. The barman studied him another moment, then nodded. "Harriet Hadley is a good woman. She doesn't deserve what is being done to her." "No," Benjamin agreed. "I do not expect she does." He slept 3 hours in the stable next to Rosalind, rolled in his saddle blanket on a pile of clean straw. He was awake again when the moon had swung past its peak, and the night had settled into that deep, breathless quiet that preceded the first gray softening before dawn. He saddled Rosalind with unhurried, practiced movements, talked her through it the way he always did, and rode out of Caldwell before the rest of the town had stirred. The road southwest was pale silver under the moon, hard-packed and straight for the first several miles before it began to meander along the natural contours of the land. He passed Fletcher's mill, a dark shape against the darker sky, and found the split cottonwood exactly where the barman had described it. He turned south. The creek was low this time of summer but still running, whispering over stones in the darkness, and he followed its course as the sky began to lighten imperceptibly in the east. He was thinking about what he would say. He had no particular skill with words in careful situations. He could tell a good story around a campfire, and he could give clear, direct instruction to green hands on a cattle drive, but the softer social arts had always required more effort from him. He had ridden 14 miles through the night to stand beside a woman he had never met, and he was going to have to explain that in a way that did not make him sound either foolish or threatening. And he was aware that from her perspective, a strange man appearing at dawn on her property was more likely to fall into the threatening category regardless of his intentions. He crested the low rise just as the first true light touched the east, and he saw the house. It was a solid place, built of cottonwood logs that had weathered to a silver gray, with a stone chimney at the west end and a covered porch running the length of the front. Behind it stood a barn, older than the house by the look of it, and a chicken coop, and a kitchen garden bordered by stones. Fields stretched south and east, mostly wheat, some of it already harvested and the stubble pale in the early light. The Cimarron was visible beyond the southern fields as a line of darker green, the cottonwoods and willows that marked its banks still holding their summer fullness. It was a beautiful piece of land. Benjamin understood immediately why someone would want it and why someone would refuse to give it up. He stopped Rosalind at the base of the rise and did not ride closer, because he did not want to come up fast on someone's door at dawn and frighten anybody. He was still sitting there considering the best approach when the front door of the house opened, and a figure stepped out onto the porch. She had a rifle. He raised both hands, which was the sensible thing to do. "I am not here to cause trouble," he called across the distance, keeping his voice level and carrying. "My name is Benjamin Keating. I heard something in Caldwell last night that I could not ride away from. I'm not working for Colton." A long silence. The figure on the porch held the rifle without pointing it directly at him, which he took as a cautiously encouraging sign. "Who told you about Colton?" she called back. "2 men at the Silver Fork. They were not trying to tell me. I just happened to be sitting close enough to hear." Another silence. He sat still and kept his hands where she could see them and waited, because patience was something he had in genuine abundance. "Ride up slowly," she said, "and keep your hands where I can see them." He did exactly that. As he came closer, the figure resolved into a woman of perhaps 24 or 25, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of face that had been made more striking by weather and work rather than diminished by it. She was wearing a plain work dress and boots, her dark hair pulled back but not yet fully pinned for the day, and she held that rifle with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had been using one since childhood. Her eyes were a color he would later determine to be a sort of complicated amber brown, but in the early morning light they were simply dark and very direct. Harriet Hadley looked at him the way women on the frontier had learned to look at strangers, which was to say carefully and without any particular generosity, because generosity could be exploited and carefulness kept a person alive. "Benjamin Keating," she said, not quite as a question. "Yes, ma'am. You rode from Caldwell in the dark." "Yes, ma'am. Because you heard two men talking in a saloon. Yes, ma'am. She regarded him steadily. That is either a very good reason or a very strange one, and I have not decided which. I am inclined to agree with you, he said. The corner of her mouth moved in a way that might have been the very beginning of something. She lowered the rifle. Come down off that horse. I am going to make coffee. He dismounted and tied Rosalind to the porch rail, and the horse immediately found something interesting to investigate near the base of the steps, and Harriet looked at her with an expression that softened momentarily and completely. She is beautiful, she said. She is the best horse I have ever owned, Benjamin said honestly. Harriet turned and went inside, and he followed her, because she had invited him to, and because the smell of coffee was already beginning to thread through the morning air. The inside of the house was clean and well-ordered, with the particular neatness of someone who lived alone and had made a deliberate practice of it. A stone hearth anchored the main room, and there were shelves of books along one wall, more books than he expected, and a worktable covered in papers near the window that faced east to catch the morning light. A butter churn stood in one corner. Braided rugs covered the floor. On the mantelpiece, there was a framed photograph of two people he took to be her parents, and beside it a small glass jar holding a stem of dried wildflowers, purple coneflower by the look of them. She set a kettle on the stove and moved through her kitchen with the easy efficiency of someone who had been running a household without assistance for long enough that every motion had been pared down to its necessary minimum. "How long have you been working the range?" she asked, not looking at him, reaching for coffee. "Going on 10 years, he said. "Started when I was 18 with an outfit out of Texas, worked my way north over the years. I was headed for Wichita when I stopped in Caldwell last night." "And now you are here instead?" "Yes, ma'am." She poured water into the coffee pot and turned to look at him directly. "Mr. Keating, I appreciate that you rode out here, and I want to believe your intentions are what you say they are. But I need you to understand that I am not a woman who needs rescuing. I'm a woman who needs practical help, and I am not too proud to say so, but there is a difference." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "There is a very large difference, and I understand it completely." She studied him. "You do not seem like a man who is trying to be a hero. I am a long way from a hero. I am a working cowboy who heard something that seemed wrong and thought I might be useful. Can you read legal documents?" The question surprised him. "Reasonably well. I had some schooling." She crossed to the worktable by the window and picked up a sheaf of papers held together with a length of twine. She brought them to him. "These arrived 4 days ago. They are from a lawyer in Caldwell named Prescott who is representing a man called Douglas Colton. I have read them several times and I am reasonably well educated, but the language is deliberately obfuscated, and I cannot tell whether what they are claiming has any actual legal standing or whether it is pure intimidation." He took the papers and sat down at the table and read them while she finished making coffee. It took him a while, because the language was indeed deliberately tangled, the kind of legal prose designed to make a layman feel overwhelmed and outmatched. But he had spent enough time in enough frontier towns, watching enough land disputes and cattle ownership arguments, to understand the general shape of what was being attempted. When she set a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down across the table, he set the papers down and looked at her. "This is claiming that your property taxes for the years 1879 and 1880 were never paid, and that under the terms of Kansas territorial law, unpaid taxes of 3 or more years render the title subject to reclamation by the county, who can then auction the property." He paused. "Did you pay your taxes those years?" "I paid them," she said with a flatness in her voice that indicated she had been expecting some version of this answer and was neither surprised nor unprepared. "I have the receipts. My father paid them and I have been paying them every year since he died. I have every receipt going back to 1871. Where are they?" She rose, went to the shelf below the books and produced a wooden box. She set it on the table and opened it, and inside, organized with the kind of careful diligence that suggested she had known someday this box would matter enormously, were paper receipts in chronological order, each one signed by the Sumner County Tax Collector's office. He went through them. She drank her coffee and watched him. "They are all here," he said. "Every year, including 1879 and 1880. "I know they are," she said. "But I also know that what a woman can demonstrate with a box of receipts and what a man with a bought county assessor can demonstrate with a forged ledger are two very different things in the eyes of a Kansas court in 1882. She was not wrong, and he did not insult her by pretending otherwise. "Have you spoken to a lawyer of your own?" The only lawyer in Caldwell who is not affiliated with Colton in some way is an older gentleman named Marcus Hale. He is not in excellent health, but he is honest and he agreed to look at the case. He told me I have a strong legal claim, but that without someone to appear in my corner at the county hearing, the combination of Colton's money and Prescott's legal maneuvering could very easily carry the day regardless of the facts. "When is the hearing?" She met his eyes. 11 days. He leaned back in the chair and looked out the east window, where the morning light was now coming in broad and warm, gilding the wheat stubble in the fields beyond. 11 days. The Double Arrow outfit was expecting him in Wichita. He thought about that, weighed it, and set it aside. "What do you need?" he asked. For the first time, something in her expression shifted in a way that went beyond the careful assessment she had been maintaining since he rode up. It was not weakness, and it was not gratitude exactly, not the kind that made a person feel they owed something. It was more like relief, the specific relief of someone who had been standing alone against a hard wind and has just felt someone step up beside them and plant their feet. "I need someone who can ride to Medicine Lodge and speak to the federal land office," she said. "Marcus Hale believes that if we can get a federal land office representative to attend the county hearing and verify the original title deed, it complicates Colton's claim significantly. The county assessor is in Colton's pocket, but the federal land office is a different jurisdiction entirely." "I can do that," Benjamin said. "How far is Medicine Lodge?" "About 35 miles. I can ride there today and be back by tomorrow evening if I push." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Keating, I want to ask you directly, why are you doing this?" It was a fair question, and it deserved a fair answer. He thought about it honestly rather than reaching for something impressive to say. "I was raised by a mother who homesteaded in Texas after my father died. I watched men try to take what was hers. Some of them succeeded. I do not like to watch that happen to a person when there is something I might be able to do about it." Harriet Hadley held his gaze for a long moment. "Your mother," she said quietly, "did she keep her land?" "Some of it. She kept enough." She nodded, as if that answer satisfied something she had not been able to articulate as a question. "All right, Mr. Keating, I will accept your help, and when this is over, whatever the outcome, I would like to pay you for your time." "I would not take money for this," he said. "You should." "I will not." A small silence, and then she said, with the ghost of something that was definitely a smile this time, "You are a very stubborn man." "I have been told that," he agreed. He rode to Medicine Lodge that same morning, carrying a letter from Harriet addressed to the federal land office representative and another from Marcus Hale laying out the legal particulars of the situation. Rosalind, well rested from the stable in Caldwell, covered the distance in good time, and Benjamin arrived in Medicine Lodge shortly before 3 in the afternoon. The federal land office was a modest frame building on the main street, and the representative there was a compact, serious-faced man named Gerald Fitch who wore wire-rimmed spectacles and had the air of someone who had seen every variety of frontier land dispute and found most of them depressing. He read both letters with careful attention while Benjamin sat across the desk from him and tried not to show his impatience. "Douglas Colton," Fitch said, setting the letters down. "He has filed 3 other title claims in this county in the past 18 months. 2 of them went through uncontested because the landowners did not have adequate documentation or legal representation. Mrs. Hadley has documentation," Benjamin said. "She has every tax receipt going back to 1871. Fitch looked at him over the spectacles. "You have seen them yourself. This morning. They are complete and they are in order." Fitch was quiet for a moment, tapping one finger on the desk. "A false claim against a properly documented homestead title is a federal offense," he said, more to himself than to Benjamin. "If Colton's people have tampered with county tax records to manufacture grounds for title reclamation, that is not merely a civil matter." "No," Benjamin agreed. "It is not." Fitch removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a cloth from his drawer. "I will attend the hearing," he said. "And I will bring the federal copies of the original Hadley land title, which were filed with this office in 1869. If the county's records have been altered, the federal records will demonstrate it." Benjamin rode back toward the Hadley property with the morning sun at his back and a kind of purposeful energy in his chest that had nothing to do with coffee. He pushed Rosalind at a steady pace and made the return journey in better time than the outward one, and he arrived at the low rise above Harriet's house as the afternoon light was going golden over the fields. She was in the kitchen garden when he rode up, weeding between the rows of late summer vegetables, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and dirt on her hands. She looked up and shaded her eyes against the light, and when she saw the expression on his face, she straightened and came to the garden fence. "He is coming?" she asked. "Gerald Fitch, Federal Land Office representative. He will attend the hearing. He is bringing the original federal copies of your title." Harriet Hadley put her hands on the top rail of the garden fence and closed her eyes for just a moment, and he thought he saw her exhale something she had been holding for a very long time. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him, and the directness and the composure were back, but there was something warmer underneath them now that he suspected she did not show to many people. "Come in," she said. "I will feed you. You have been riding since before dawn." He protested, mildly and without conviction, that he could sleep in the barn and he did not want to put her out, and she dismissed this with a gesture that indicated she had heard enough nonsense for one day, and he followed her inside. She had rabbit stew on the stove, which she had clearly been preparing that afternoon, and cornbread in the oven, and he sat at her table and ate more than he had eaten at one sitting in recent memory, while she asked him about Gerald Fitch, and he told her everything that had been said in the land office with the thoroughness of a man who has understood that a complete report is more useful than a summary. She listened with the focused attention of someone who filed information carefully and completely. She asked 2 questions, both precise and well-targeted. When he finished, she sat back and looked at the papers on her work table with a different expression than the one she had been wearing when she handed them to him that morning. Not confidence exactly, but something solidifying in her. "You are good at this," she said, "at getting things done." "I have never particularly tried to be," he said. "Things just seem like they either need doing or they do not." She turned her eyes back to him, and something in the quality of her attention changed, became less analytical and more simply observational. "Where are you from originally?" "East Texas, near Nacogdoches. Family still there. My mother passed 3 years ago. I have a brother in San Antonio who runs a dry goods store." He paused. "We write sometimes." "I know about that kind of family," she said. "People you love from a distance because life has gone different directions." "Yes, exactly that." She rose to clear the dishes and he stood to help, and she led him without argument, which he noticed. They moved around the small kitchen with a surprisingly comfortable lack of collision, 2 people who had apparently been designed to occupy the same space without friction. "Your father?" he asked, handing her the stew pot. "He died 4 years ago. Winter of 1878, pneumonia." She said it in the way people said things they had made peace with through the discipline of repetition. "He was a good man. He homesteaded this land in 1869 when I was about 12 years old. We came from Missouri. My mother died when I was 8, so it was just the 2 of us." She paused. "He taught me everything about this land. How to work it, how to read the weather, where the aquifer runs, which fields drain well and which do not. He always said land was the only thing that was honest because it did not pretend to be something it was not, Benjamin thought about that. He sounds like he was wise. He was practical, she said, which is sometimes the same thing and sometimes better. She dried the last dish and set it on the shelf, and then turned and looked at him with her amber-dark eyes in the warm light of the oil lamp. "You can sleep in the house. There is a cot in the back room. I will not have you sleeping in the barn when I have a perfectly adequate cot." "I do not want to trouble you," he said, and she gave him a look that suggested he was trying her patience. "Mr. Keating," she said, "go to sleep." He went asleep. The next 8 days were nothing like what he had expected, and everything he had not known to hope for. He had assumed he would wait out the time until the hearing, doing small, useful tasks, mending fence and chopping wood and keeping himself occupied, the way a man did when he was staying somewhere on sufferance and wanted to demonstrate his worth without overstepping. What he had not anticipated was that Harriet Hadley would simply incorporate him into the working rhythms of her property as naturally as if he had always been part of them, with the pragmatic efficiency of a woman who had 100 things to do and had just acquired an able-bodied assistant without a great deal of ceremony. The first morning she handed him a fence post and a mallet and pointed to the south field, where 3 posts had heaved out of the ground over winter and not been reset. He reset them. She appeared around midday to inspect, made one small correction with her own hands, and said, "Good," in the tone of a person who did not dispense praise lightly and meant it when they did. The second day they worked side by side repairing the barn roof, which had developed a section of loose shingles above the main beam. He was on the roof and she was below, passing shingles up and making remarks about the work that were so technically precise that he stopped after the 4th one and looked down at her. "You have done roofing before," he said. "I have done everything here before," she said. "I just prefer to have someone on the roof who is taller than I am when it is possible." He laughed. It came out of him suddenly and genuinely, and she looked up with an expression of mild surprise, as if his laugh had turned out to be somewhat more than she had expected. In the evenings they sat on the porch and she read sometimes, or they talked. They talked in the way that happens when 2 people are both intelligent and honest, and have no particular agenda with each other, which is to say they talked about real things, the kind of things that take a while to arrive at under ordinary social circumstances, but that a shared situation of difficulty and purpose seems to accelerate. He told her about the cattle drives, the particular loneliness of the range and also its particular freedom. The way the sky over the Kansas plains in early morning was different from any other sky he had ever seen, wider and somehow more serious. She told him about her father's vision for the property, the irrigation system he had designed, and she had finished building after his death, the hybrid wheat variety she had been developing through selective seeding over the past 3 years, which was producing yields that were beginning to attract attention from neighboring farmers who wanted to understand what she was doing differently. "You have been doing agricultural experimentation on your own," he said. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who is not accustomed to having that reality stated plainly and with respect. "Yes," she said, "my father was interested in it. I kept his notes and built on them." "That is remarkable." She was quiet for a moment. "Most people find it unusual, a woman alone doing that kind of systematic work. Most people," he said, "are not paying close enough attention." She looked away toward the dark fields and the ribbon of deeper dark where the Cimarron ran, and the silence between them was comfortable and alive with something neither of them named because neither of them was quite ready to name it. On the 4th day, one of Colton's men came. He arrived in the late afternoon, while Harriet was in the kitchen garden, and Benjamin was splitting wood by the barn. The man rode a well-fed bay horse and wore clothes that were too clean for honest ranch work, which told Benjamin what he needed to know. He came up the path at an unhurried trot and reined in at the sight of Benjamin, who had set down his axe and was standing in a relaxed posture that was not aggressive and not deferential. "I am looking for the Hadley woman," the man said. "Miss Hadley is occupied," Benjamin said. "What is your business?" The man looked him over with a calculating expression. He was perhaps 35, thick-shouldered with small, pale eyes. "That is not your concern. Who are you?" "A friend of the property," Benjamin said. "What is your business?" The man shifted in his saddle. He had clearly not expected any obstacle. "I have a message from Mr. Colton. He has authorized me to offer a last increase on the purchase price, $500 more than his last offer." "Miss Hadley has made her position clear," Benjamin said. "She is not selling. Mr. Colton feels strongly that she would benefit from reconsidering." "Mr. Colton's feelings are noted," Benjamin said pleasantly. "Her position has not changed. You are welcome to ride back and report that." The man looked at him for a long moment with those pale, calculating eyes, and Benjamin held his gaze without any particular drama, just steadily and without movement, the way you face things that were trying to decide whether you were worth the trouble. Whatever the man decided, he turned his horse without another word and rode back down the path. Harriet had appeared at the edge of the kitchen garden during the latter part of this exchange. She walked toward him, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression measured. "Thank you," she said, "although I could have handled that myself." "I know you could have," he said, "but you were occupied and I was here." She looked at him for a moment with that evaluating quality she had, and then something in it shifted, warmed. "Yes," she said, "you were here. That evening on the porch," she said. "Can I ask you something direct?" "You have been asking me direct questions since the first morning," he pointed out. "I do not expect you to stop now." She looked at her hands folded in her lap. "When this hearing is over, whatever happens, where will you go?" He had been thinking about this himself, honestly, in the quiet back reaches of his mind, where things worked themselves out without his deliberate participation. The Double Arrow outfit, Wichita, the autumn drive north. He had been telling himself those things were waiting for him and that nothing had changed about his situation, which was technically true and also increasingly beside the point. "I had obligations in Wichita," he said carefully. "I have written to the outfit explaining I have been delayed by circumstances and asking if they can still use me when this is settled." She turned her head to look at him. "You wrote to them. 3 days ago, I rode to Caldwell and sent a letter. You did not mention it." "No." "Benjamin." It was the first time she had used his given name, and it landed differently than the formal address had, with a warmth and directness that made him entirely still. "Are you planning to stay?" He met her eyes in the soft darkness of the porch. The fireflies were beginning in the fields, little cold sparks drifting up from the grass, and the cimarron made its quiet sound in the distance, and the night air smelled of cut wheat and summer earth. "I would like to," he said, "if that is something you would want." She was quiet for a while, not hesitant, he did not think, but thinking through something honestly, which was what she did with everything. "I have been alone for 4 years," she said. "I made a kind of peace with that. I built a life inside it. I am not a woman who needs company for the sake of it." "No," he said, "I know that." "But I find that I do not particularly want you to leave," she said, as if reporting an observation she found both accurate and somewhat surprising. "And I thought you should know that." He looked at her, the clean line of her profile against the last pale glow of the western sky, the dark hair that had come half loose from its pins the way it did every evening by this hour, the hands in her lap that had worked this land every day for 4 years without help and without complaint. "I am glad," he said quietly. "I find I feel the same." She did not answer in words, but she shifted in her chair so that it was angled slightly more toward his, a small movement that in the careful grammar of their developing understanding meant something considerably larger. They sat together on the porch until the stars were fully out, and talked about smaller things, comfortable things, and the fireflies drifted up from the fields, and neither of them moved to go inside until the night was very late. The day of the hearing arrived with a sky like hammered copper, hot and bright in the way of late Kansas summer, the kind of day that made everything feel slightly more consequential than it might have under cloud cover. Marcus Hale arrived at the property early in a small buggy, moving with the deliberate care of a man whose health required him to conserve energy. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, with sharp blue eyes that had retained all their intelligence even as the rest of him showed the wear of years. He shook Benjamin's hand with a firm grip and looked at Harriet with the particular respect of a man who genuinely admired her. "Gerald Fitch rode in from Medicine Lodge last night," he told them. "He is in Caldwell with the federal documents. He is prepared to testify." Harriet was dressed for the occasion in her cleanest dress, a dark blue wool that she had clearly pressed carefully that morning, with her hair pinned up with more precision than the usual arrangements of their working days. She had her box of tax receipts and a leather folder containing copies of documents she and Marcus Hale had prepared together over the preceding week. She was composed and focused and almost completely calm in the way of someone who has done everything possible and resolved to accept the outcome of what they cannot fully control. Almost completely calm, not entirely. Benjamin could see, because he had been watching her carefully for over a week now, the slight tension in the line of her jaw and the way her hands went still sometimes when she was not directing them to do anything, which was her version of anxiety, this quality of absolute stillness. When Marcus Hale turned to speak with his driver about the arrangement of the buggy, Benjamin moved to stand beside her. He did not touch her because they were not yet at that place in their understanding and he would not presume, but he stood close enough that she could feel he was there. She turned her head and looked at him. "You have this," he said quietly. "You have the documentation, you have Marcus, you have Fitch, and you have 11 years of honest work on this land. The truth is on your side." "The truth has not always been sufficient in these situations," she said, which was accurate. "No," he agreed. "But today you have people to stand with you and that changes the balance." She held his eyes for a moment. "Yes," she said, "it does." The county courthouse in Caldwell was a frame building of some self-importance, with a raised platform at one end of the main room and rows of benches that were filled this morning beyond their usual capacity. Word had evidently gotten around, the way word always got around in small frontier towns where land disputes were public entertainment as well as public business. Benjamin recognized the barman from the Silver Fork among the crowd, and several farmers he had seen at a distance in neighboring fields over the past week. He also recognized the tall, red-faced man in the brass-buttoned vest from the saloon conversation that had set everything in motion, sitting near the front with an expression of aggressive proprietariness. Douglas Colton himself was a man of perhaps 50, well-dressed in the frontier fashion, with silver at his temples and the particular bearing of someone who had been successful enough for long enough that disappointment had become genuinely foreign to him. He sat at a table on one side of the room with the lawyer Prescott, a thin, reedy man whose documents were arranged before him with military precision. Harriet, Marcus Hale, and Benjamin sat at the other table. Gerald Fitch was in the front row of the benches, his leather document case across his knees. The county judge was a broad man named Holloway with a red face and small eyes who called the room to order with a wooden mallet and no particular enthusiasm. Benjamin watched him with care, trying to determine from his manner whether he was another piece of Colton's purchased apparatus or merely the mechanism through which the day's events would flow. Prescott spoke first, presenting his case with smooth, practiced authority. "The tax records," he said, demonstrated clearly that payments had been missed in 1879 and 1880. He produced a county ledger, its pages showing entries in a neat hand. He referred to the relevant statutes with citations that had clearly been prepared with considerable care. The county assessor, a small nervous man named Wickham who kept his eyes on the table in front of him, was called to confirm the records. He confirmed them without looking at Harriet. Benjamin watched Harriet while all of this was presented. She sat still with her hands folded on the table and her eyes on Prescott, and she did not show anything on her face except attention. Then Marcus Hale rose. He moved slowly, but there was nothing diminished about his presence when he was on his feet. He spoke about the Hadley property's history with the quiet authority of someone presenting facts that required no rhetorical decoration. He entered the tax receipts into evidence, each one dated, each one bearing the county collector's signature. He called Benjamin to testify that he had examined the receipts himself and found them complete and in order, which Benjamin did plainly and without elaboration. Then he called Gerald Fitch. Fitch came forward with his document case, and the room shifted in some subtle way, because a federal representative was a different order of presence than a local lawyer in a county courthouse, and everyone in the room understood that. He laid the federal copies of the original Hadley land title on the judge's table and explained their provenance and their standing. He then produced a separate document that he explained carefully was a comparison of the federal land office's recorded tax submissions from Sumner County against the county's own ledger, submitted annually as part of the standard verification process. He pointed to the entries for 1879 and 1880. The county ledger entered into evidence today shows no payment received from the Hadley property for these years, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. The federal office's own annual verification records, which the county is required to submit and which cannot be retroactively altered because they are held in Medicine Lodge and not in Caldwell, show payments received and acknowledged for both 1879 and 1880. The amounts match the receipts in evidence. He paused and looked at Judge Holloway over his spectacles. The county ledger has been altered. The original entries have been changed. This is not a question of missing documentation. This is falsification of public records, which is a federal offense. The room was not entirely silent, because rooms full of people never are, but the sound that moved through it was the particular sound of a story that has just changed its ending. Wickham, the county assessor, had gone a color that was not quite any natural human color, somewhere between gray and green. Prescott was on his feet, objecting with the desperate energy of a man throwing sandbags against a flood, but Judge Holloway was looking at the federal documents with a focused attention that suggested he was, whatever his other qualities, genuinely interested in remaining a judge rather than becoming a defendant. Colton sat very still. Benjamin looked at him and thought he saw the exact moment when the man performed the calculation, and found that the result was not what he had invested in. It took Judge Holloway another 40 minutes of procedural process that Benjamin followed with close attention, but the outcome was what the evidence required. The claim against the Hadley title was dismissed. The county assessor's records were referred to the federal circuit for investigation of falsification. Judge Holloway, with a look at Colton that carried its own message about the value of purchasing local authorities only to have them become liabilities, closed the hearing. Outside on the courthouse steps in the bright copper heat of the afternoon, Harriet Hadley stood with her document folder in her hands and said nothing for a moment. Then she turned to Marcus Hale, and the old lawyer took her hand in both of his and said, "Your father would have been very pleased today." And she held that quietly for a moment with something in her eyes that she kept very controlled. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. "Truly." He patted her hand and went to find his buggy, moving with the careful energy of a man who has spent himself on something worth spending himself on. She turned to Gerald Fitch, who was already replacing his documents in the case with methodical satisfaction. She thanked him with the direct, sincere courtesy she brought to everything, and he said that the federal office would be watching this county more carefully going forward, which was both a promise and a warning to anyone listening. Then she turned to Benjamin. He was standing on the bottom step, hat in his hands, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because after 8 days of working toward this moment it had arrived, and the space on the other side of it was open and undefined and full of a kind of possibility that neither of them had let themselves look at directly until now. "It is over," she said. "It is over," he agreed. She came down the last 2 steps until she was level with him, and she looked at him with those amber-dark eyes, and for once the careful evaluation was entirely gone from them, and what was there instead was something simpler and much larger. "Benjamin," she said. "Yes," he said. And then she did something he had not expected, which was to step forward and put her forehead against his shoulder, just briefly, just for a moment, the way a person does when they have been carrying something heavy for a very long time and have just been allowed to set it down. He put one hand against her back, steady and careful, and they stood like that for just a breath, in the bright afternoon outside the Caldwell courthouse. Then she straightened and stepped back, and the composure was back, but it was a different kind of composure now, warmer and less defended. "Come home," she said, as if she had always said it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He put his hat back on and walked with her to where Rosalind and Harriet's steady brown mare were tied at the rail. They rode home along the road south and west, and the afternoon light went gold and long across the flat land, and the wildflowers in the grass beside the road were purple and yellow, and the color of the sky reflected in standing water, and Harriet talked about what she wanted to do with the south field next spring, and he listened and thought about the irrigation system she had described and asked a question, and she answered it with a precision and depth of knowledge that made him want to ask another. And they talked like that all the way back to the low rise above her land. The weeks that followed were the kind that build themselves slowly and solidly into something that can hold weight. Douglas Colton left Caldwell before the month was out. Word came through the farming community that the federal investigation into the county assessor's records had turned up 2 other cases of altered ledgers, both involving properties that Colton had already acquired, and that a circuit court judge was taking a serious interest in the matter. It was said that Colton had gone south toward the Indian Territory, and that his plans for a rail spur through Sumner County had been quietly dismantled. Wickham the assessor resigned and left town. Prescott the lawyer found his practice suddenly reduced to clients who could not afford to pay him, which was a natural consequence of his association with a man whose fortunes had reversed so publicly. Benjamin wrote to the Double Arrow outfit in Wichita and withdrew his application for the autumn drive, a decision he made without regret, though he was honest with himself about the fact that he was making it and what it meant. What it meant was that he was staying. He stayed first in the capacity of a hired hand, because that was the most honest framework available to them while they were still finding the shape of what they were to each other. He slept in the barn, on a proper cot he had built from materials in Harriet's barn, and he worked the property alongside her with the same thoroughness he brought to everything. And they fell into the daily rhythms of 2 people who are discovering that their particular ways of working and thinking and approaching problems fit together with a completeness that surprises them both. He learned the property the way she had always known it, not quickly, but with the kind of patient thoroughness that she recognized and respected. She taught him the irrigation system, walking him through every channel and valve, and explaining the reasoning behind each choice her father had made and each modification she had added herself. He brought to it the practical engineering sense he had developed over years of improvising solutions on cattle drives and remote ranches, and occasionally he suggested something and she looked at it carefully and said yes, that would work, and they added it, and those additions became part of the property's fabric. He learned where the aquifer ran, which she had known since she was 12 years old. He learned which fields drained east and which held water and needed to be managed differently in a wet year. He learned the particular temperaments of her animals, the brown mare whose name was Cleo and who required to be talked to during thunderstorms, and the old milk cow who gave excellent milk but had to be approached from the left side or she would be difficult, and the 3 dogs who sorted themselves by territory in a way that had its own internal logic once you understood it. She learned him too. She learned that he was quieter in the morning than the evening, and that his best thinking happened when his hands were occupied with physical work, so that some of his best ideas came out while he was mending fence or mucking the barn. She learned that he took obligations seriously to the point of stubbornness, and that the most effective way to suggest he was wrong about something was to present the evidence plainly and let him work it through himself, because if you pushed directly, he would simply become more fixed. She learned that he had a gift for reading weather that was almost uncanny, some combination of instinct and observation that let him predict turns in the sky hours before they became visible to an ordinary eye, which was enormously useful on the prairie, and which she teased him about with a gentle precision that made him laugh in that sudden, genuine way she had come to love. In the second week of September, 3 weeks after the hearing, they were coming back from the south field in the late afternoon, walking because neither had ridden out, and the sky ahead was doing something magnificent with the late light, turning colors that had no proper names, and Harriet stopped walking and looked at it. "I love this," she said. "This exact thing. This hour, this sky, this land." He stopped beside her. "I know," he said, because he had been watching her have this exact reaction to this exact kind of light for weeks, and he understood exactly what she meant. She turned her head and looked at him, and the light was on her face, and he looked at her and stopped managing the careful distance he had been maintaining. "Harriet," he said. She was already looking at him with that open, unhurried expression he had come to understand was her version of complete trust, and she said, "Yes, Benjamin," in a voice that was quiet and entirely certain. He kissed her there in the late September light in the south field, gently, and with the particular care of a man who understood the weight of what he was doing, and she kissed him back with the wholehearted directness she brought to everything, and the sky went on doing its magnificent, unrepeatable thing above them. They stood together in the field for a long time afterward, not saying anything that needed to be said in words. October came, and with it the particular beauty of the Kansas autumn, the sky a deeper blue and the cottonwoods along the Cimarron going gold, and the air carrying the smell of turned earth and the first cold edge of the season to come. The wheat harvest was in, and Harriet's hybrid variety had yielded numbers that she recorded in her father's old notebook, with a satisfaction she did not particularly hide. 3 neighboring farmers came by in the first week of October, separately and with their hats in their hands, to ask about her seed stock and her methods. She spent an afternoon with each of them, sitting at her work table with her notes spread out, explaining her selective seeding process with the careful thoroughness of someone who had done this work and wanted it to be understood correctly. Benjamin came in and out during these conversations on various errands and heard enough to understand that she had something genuinely significant in what she had developed, something beyond what a local farming community could fully appreciate. One evening he said, "Have you written to any of the agricultural colleges? Kansas State is in Manhattan and they have been doing work on wheat cultivation. What you have developed might interest them considerably." She looked at him. "I had not thought of that." "Your father's notes plus 3 years of systematic results. That is not nothing, Harriet. That is actual science." She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her considering it, turning it over with that careful internal process. They might not take it seriously coming from a woman alone on a homestead. They might not, he agreed honestly. But the results speak for themselves, and if Marcus Hale were to write a cover letter, and if you were to present the data in the format they use, the quality of the work would be apparent before they had decided anything about who produced it. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was warm and direct, and had something in it he could not entirely name. "You believe in this," she said. "You genuinely believe it." "I have watched you work for 2 months," he said. "I would be foolish not to believe in it." She wrote to Kansas State Agricultural College in November, enclosing the data and a careful presentation of her methodology, with a covering letter from Marcus Hale. They did not expect a rapid response, and they did not receive one, but the letter was sent and it was good, and that was enough to begin with. November was when Benjamin first said plainly what had been true for some time. They were sitting at the table after supper, and the stove was going warm against the cold that had descended in earnest with the first week of the month, and the oil lamp was steady, and the dogs were settled near the hearth, and Harriet was reading something from a farming journal that had come in the post. He was reading nothing, which was unusual for him, which she noticed. She set the journal down and looked at him. "What is it?" He had been thinking about how to say it and had concluded that he was not going to improve on plain honesty, which was generally the case with him. "I love you," he said. "I wanted to say it plainly so there would be no question about it." She looked at him with those eyes that he had been reading now for months, and what was in them was certain and warm and entirely without ambiguity. "I know," she said. "I have known for a while." She paused. "I love you too, Benjamin. I have been waiting to be sure I could say it properly, and I find that I can." He reached across the table and she put her hand in his, and they sat like that with the stove going warm and the dogs breathing near the hearth and the November wind moving outside around the solid cottonwood walls of the house her father had built. "I would like to stay," he said, "permanently, for the rest of things, if that is what you want. Is that a proposal?" She asked, and her voice had that quality he loved, that precise dryness with the warmth underneath it. "It is the intention behind a proposal," he said. "The actual proposal I have been considering more carefully, and I would like to do it properly." "All right," she said. "I will look forward to it." He proposed properly on a Sunday morning in late November, on the porch before the weather had quite turned, with the sun coming pale and clear over the frost-white fields. He had a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet that he had carried in the bottom of his saddlebag for the 3 years since her death without any particular plan. The way you carry something that matters to you even when you do not know what you are carrying it for. He asked her with complete honesty, telling her that he had not planned any of this and that it had found him in a saloon on a July night, and that he was grateful for it in a way he did not have adequate words for, and that he wanted to build a life on this land beside her if she would have him, and that he understood it was her land and her life, and he was not coming to take any part of it over, only to add himself to it if she wanted him added. She was very still while he said all of this, standing in the cold sunlight on the porch she had stood on alone for 4 years, and then she looked at the ring in his hand and at him, and she said yes with a directness and completeness that left nothing uncertain. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it for a moment, and then she put both arms around him and he held her there in the November sunlight, the cold air sharp around them and the land they were standing on stretching away in all directions, bare and golden and entirely their own. They married in January of 1883, in the small Caldwell church on a clear cold afternoon with about 30 people in attendance, which was most of the farming community within 10 miles, and all of the people who had followed the Hadley land case with sympathetic interest. Marcus Hale stood up with them, moving carefully but with great dignity, and 3 of the neighboring farming families came with their best Sunday clothes and their children and their goodwill. The Reverend was a young man named Collins who had arrived in Caldwell the previous spring, and conducted himself with an earnest sincerity that made him generally well liked. He read the service in full, which suited both of them, and when Benjamin put Harriet's hand in his for the final words, it was with the particular quality of seriousness he brought to things that truly mattered, every bit of his attention present and accounted for. Harriet was wearing the best dress she owned, a deep green wool she had been keeping for special occasions since she had made it 2 years prior, and she had done her hair with more elaboration than usual, and she was so precisely and completely herself in every particular that Benjamin had a moment of almost overwhelming feeling that he managed by looking at the Reverend's collar instead of her face until it settled. When the Reverend said he might kiss his bride and he turned to her, she was looking at him with her honest, certain eyes, and he kissed her with the same careful gentleness of the South Field in September, and she put her hand against his chest, and the small church was warm with people who were genuinely glad. The celebration afterward was at the Hadley property, which was now the Keating property. though Harriet kept her own name alongside his in the way that felt right to both of them. The neighboring families had contributed food, and one of them had a fiddle player who knew 15 songs and played them all twice, and the dogs were bewildered by so many people in the yard and conducted themselves with resigned dignity. And someone had brought a jug of something that was technically cider and technically nothing else. And the afternoon went on warm and full until the January stars came out. When the last guests had gone and the yard was quiet again, they stood together on the porch in the cold night and looked at the dark land and the stars, which in January were brilliant and close, the way they only were in the coldest clear nights. "Well," Harriet said. "Well," he agreed. She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the comfortable silence that was one of the best things about who they were to each other, the silence that needed nothing added to it. "I am glad," she said quietly, "that you stopped in Caldwell. I am glad I heard two men talking when I was too tired to move to a different part of the bar," he said. She laughed, and it was one of the things he loved best about her, that her laugh came full and genuine when it came, nothing held back about it. "Come inside," she said. "It is cold." He followed her inside, and the door closed on the winter night, and the stove was going warm, and the dogs settled, and the house held them with the solid certainty of cottonwood logs set deep in Kansas earth. Spring came with the particular velocity of prairie springs, as if the land had been gathering itself all winter for a concentrated release. The fields were plowed in March, and the hybrid wheat seed was planted in April with the careful precision that Harriet's 3 years of methodology had established, and Benjamin worked beside her through every stage of it with the thoroughness that had become the signature of how they did things together. A letter arrived in April from Kansas State Agricultural College. It was written by a Professor William Garrett of the Agricultural Sciences Department, and it was 3 pages long, which was more than either of them had expected. He had read Harriet's submission with, he said, considerable interest, and he wanted to know more about the specific characteristics of the parent stock she had worked with and the precise conditions of her selective criteria. He had shared the data with 2 colleagues, and they were in agreement that the yield improvements she was documenting were significantly above what current Kansas wheat varieties were producing, and that her methodology, if sound, had implications for agricultural development across the region. He asked whether she would be willing to correspond further and potentially to provide a seed sample for controlled cultivation trials. Harriet read this letter twice at the work table and then sat very still for a moment. Benjamin was across the table watching her. "What does it say?" She looked up, and her expression was something he had not quite seen on her before, not the usual composed competence, but something younger and more open, something that looked like the particular emotion of having worked very hard on something you believed in, and having it recognized as real and worthwhile by people equipped to make that judgment. "They want to continue," she said. "They think it is significant." He smiled at her, fully and without reservation, and she looked at his smile and then looked down at the letter again, because there was a lot in his expression and she needed a moment. She wrote back to Professor Garrett that same evening, 3 careful pages, answering each of his questions with the precision her notes allowed. She agreed to provide a seed sample and to continue the correspondence. This correspondence became a thread running through the months that followed, regular letters back and forth between the Keating property on the Cimarron and a professor's office in Manhattan, Kansas, and it gave Harriet a particular kind of satisfaction that he recognized as important and that he was glad to see in her. She had been working on this alone for years, in the faith that it was worth working on, and now it was becoming part of something larger than the South Field, and she carried that with a quiet pride that he found entirely appropriate. It was in June of that first year of their marriage that Benjamin rode to Wichita and found the Double Arrow Outfits trail boss, a man named Charlie Sutton whom he had known for years, and had a conversation he had been composing for several months. He came back 2 days later with a contract in his pocket for the supply of 25 steers per season to the Double Arrow operation, at a price that reflected the current Wichita market rate. He set it on the work table in front of Harriet. She read it. She looked at him. "You want to add cattle. The south pasture has been underused. We have water from the Cimarron for additional animals. The hay production from the east field can support a modest herd and the income would be stable. You have been thinking about this for a while." "Since February," he admitted. "I wanted to understand the land fully before I suggested anything to change it." She looked at the contract again, then at the papers on her work table, then out the east window at the south pasture he was describing. He could see her doing the calculation, the same systematic evaluation she applied to everything, running the variables through her internal accounting. "Yes," she said, "let us do it." They bought 10 cattle that summer, to start, good Kansas stock from a reputable seller in Medicine Lodge, and Benjamin began building the additional fencing and infrastructure the south pasture required, while Harriet managed the wheat and her ongoing correspondence with Professor Garrett. The property grew busier and fuller, and they moved through its days together with a partnership that was so natural and well-fitted that sometimes Benjamin would stop in the middle of some task and be quietly astonished by it. He mentioned this to her one evening in late August, lying in the warm darkness after the lamp was out, his words coming slow and honest. "I spent 10 years thinking I was meant to be moving," he said. "I thought the road was the point. That arriving somewhere permanently was something that happened to other people." She was quiet for a moment. "And now I think I was just waiting to find where I was supposed to be," he said. "I do not think I understood that it would look like this, that it would be a woman alone on 300 acres in Kansas who had better sense than anyone I had ever met." He could hear the smile in her voice when she said, "That is very nearly poetic for you." "Do not tell anyone," he said. "It would ruin my reputation as a simple working cowboy." "Benjamin," she said, the words soft and certain in the dark, "there has never been anything simple about you." He put his arm around her and she settled against him, and the night was warm and the land outside was silent and full, and he thought about everything that had led to this particular darkness and this particular warmth, and found that it all made a kind of sense that had not been visible from any earlier point along the way. In October, Marcus Hale died quietly in his home in Caldwell, which he had been expecting and had put his affairs in order for, and which saddened both of them deeply though not with surprise. He left a note for Harriet with his housekeeper, which arrived on a Tuesday morning with the mail, and she read it at the kitchen table and was still for a long time afterward. She let Benjamin read it. It was short. He had written that watching her fight for and keep her land had been one of the most satisfying cases of his long career, and that her father would have been very proud, and that he wished her and her husband a long and prosperous life on the property that had been so worth fighting for. He had signed it with his full name and added beneath it, in a slightly shakier hand that suggested he had written the note when he was not at his strongest, that he thought Benjamin Keating was exactly the right kind of man for exactly the right kind of woman, and that some things worked out precisely as they should. They went together to his funeral, standing in the cold October churchyard, and Harriet laid a stem of the dried purple coneflower from her mantelpiece on his coffin, because she had nothing more elaborate to bring, and it was the right thing to bring. The winter of 1883 and 1884 was a hard one, as Kansas winters often were, but the house was solid and the stove was adequate and the cattle had shelter and the wheat stores were full. Benjamin had made additions to the barn in the autumn that proved their worth in the January cold, and the hybrid wheat seed was stored correctly, and the milk cow was managed through a difficult month by patience and good feeding. There was a lot of time indoors in a hard winter, and they used it well. He read through her father's notebooks completely, every page, following the development of the man's thinking about the land across 15 years of notes, and he asked her questions about entries that puzzled him, and she answered them. and sometimes the answering led to conversations that went on for hours, ranging from the particular chemistry of their soil to the question of whether the county's new road proposals would change the practicalities of getting to Caldwell in wet weather, to the history of farming techniques on the Great Plains, and what might reasonably be expected of the land in the coming decades. She talked to him once on a cold February evening by the stove about what it had been like when her father died. "I was 22, she said. "I had been helping him run the property since I was old enough to be useful, but I had always done it alongside him, you understand. There was always him to go back to. When he was gone, the first thing I felt was this absolute silence where the consultation had been. I knew what to do. He had taught me well. But I had always been able to bring things to him and have him think about them with me, and suddenly that was gone." "That is loneliness of a very specific kind," Benjamin said. "It is," she agreed, "and I found that I was capable of it. I found that I could live inside it without being destroyed by it, but I did not find that it was what I wanted." He looked at her across the warm lamplight. "And now I bring things to you," she said, "and you think about them with me, and it turns out that is exactly what I wanted." He reached across and took her hand, and she let him hold it without pulling away into her usual self-sufficiency, which was a form of trust he never took for granted. Spring arrived in March with its usual sudden excess, the land going green almost overnight, the creek running higher with snowmelt from the north. Their first full agricultural year was beginning, and they moved into it with the confidence of two people who have learned to work well together and know it. A letter came in April from Professor Garrett at Kansas State, and this one was longer than any of the previous ones, and had two other names signed at the bottom alongside his. He was formally requesting, with institutional backing, that Harriet's wheat variety be included in a published study of improved Kansas grain cultivars. He wanted to name the variety in the publication and asked whether she had a name for it. She thought about it for 2 days, which was typical of her with naming, which she took seriously. Then she told Benjamin she wanted to call it Hadley Pioneer. He said it was a good name. It went into the study under that name, and the study was published in the agricultural journal that she had been reading by the lamplight the night he told her he loved her. And when the issue arrived, she sat at the work table and read her name in print for a long time in silence, and then she set the journal on the table and looked at it. He set a cup of coffee in front of her and pulled up a chair beside her and looked at her name in print too. "Your father's work," he said, "finished by you." "Our work," she said, looking at him. "You found the adjustments in the East Field drainage that improved the yield that last season. Those numbers are part of what they published. The foundation was yours. The last stage was both of us," she said firmly, in the tone that indicated the matter was settled. He did not argue. He knew when not to argue. It was one of the more valuable things he had learned in the past 2 years. The cattle operation had expanded by the second spring to 20 animals, and the arrangement with the double arrow had grown to supply 30 steers annually, which represented a significant and reliable income stream alongside the wheat. They had taken on a part-time hand, a young man from Caldwell named Samuel, 17 years old, who came 3 days a week and was good with the cattle and willing to learn everything. Benjamin taught him with the patient thoroughness of someone who remembered being young and needing to be taught, and Harriet gave him lunch every day he came, which the boy clearly appreciated. It was Samuel who, one afternoon in early summer, came to find Benjamin in the south pasture with the news that Harriet was in the house, and had sent him to find Benjamin quickly. He rode Rosalind at a canter back to the house, his heart doing something concerned and preparatory, and found Harriet sitting at the kitchen table looking not alarmed, but rather with the particular expression of someone who has received information they need time to adjust to. She looked up at him when he came through the door. "I am going to have a baby," she said. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her, and something happened in him that was not describable in the vocabulary he had available, something that went too wide and too deep for the words he knew, and after a moment he crossed the room and sat down in the chair beside her and took both her hands. "Harriet," he said. "I know," she said. "I know." And she was smiling, a full and complete smile, the kind she had shown him only gradually, the kind that reached every part of her face. He leaned forward and put his forehead against hers, and they sat like that in the summer kitchen, in their house on their land beside the Cimarron, and outside the wheat was tall and green in the early light, and the cattle were quiet in the south pasture, and everything was exactly as it should be. The pregnancy progressed through the summer and autumn with the robust good health that characterized everything Harriet undertook, which was to say, she did not stop working, but she agreed to some modifications of the more physically demanding tasks, and he managed most of the heavy lifting and roof-level work during this period without making an excessive issue of it. She continued her correspondence with Professor Garrett and made 2 contributions to the ongoing study of Hadley Pioneer that were, in the professor's written assessment, characteristically excellent. He wrote to his brother in San Antonio in September, a longer letter than he usually managed, and received back a letter from his brother Robert that had a warmth in it that surprised and moved him, because they had been at such long distance from each other for so many years that warmth had become something they expressed through brevity and indirection. Robert said he was glad. He said their mother would have been glad. He said that if Benjamin found himself south of the Red River, he should come and see him, and there was something in the way he wrote it that suggested the invitation was genuine and not merely polite. Benjamin told Harriet about his brother that evening, more than he usually talked about him, and she listened with the full attention she gave to things that mattered, and said that she thought they should write to Robert and tell him he was welcome to visit Caldwell if he ever came north, because she would like to meet the person who had grown up alongside Benjamin, and because some distances were worth closing when there was no longer a reason to keep them. He wrote that letter the next morning. Their son was born in January of 1884, in the house on the Cimarron, with the help of the Caldwell doctor and a neighboring farmer's wife who had 6 children of her own and handled the whole business with calm authority. He was born on a clear, cold morning, and he was healthy and loud about it, and Benjamin sat in the chair beside Harriet's bed holding their son with the particular bewildered gravity of a man confronting something that is simultaneously the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing in the world. They named him Thomas James Keating, Thomas for her father and James for his. Thomas was a specific and energetic presence from the beginning, an infant with opinions, which seemed fitting given his parentage. He thrived through the winter, and by spring he was an unignorable feature of daily life on the property, carried in a sling across Harriet's back while she checked the wheat fields, or laid on a blanket in the kitchen while she worked at the work table, watching the ceiling with the concentrated interest of someone studying something important. Benjamin's brother Robert visited that summer, riding up from San Antonio with 2 weeks' time and a saddlebag full of candy and a small wooden horse he had made himself, which made Benjamin laugh and Harriet say that she was very glad to meet him. Robert Keating was 3 years younger than Benjamin, shorter and rounder, with their mother's eyes and a sociability that had always contrasted with his brother's quieter nature. He fit into the rhythm of the Keating property with an ease that said something about good blood and good upbringing, and he played with Thomas with genuine delight, and talked farming with Harriet with the genuine curiosity of a man who had always been indoors but was interested in what the outdoors could do, and sat on the porch with Benjamin in the evenings, and talked in the way they had not talked since they were young, easily and without the formality of long absence. On the last evening before he rode south again, Robert said to Benjamin, sitting in the dark on the porch with the summer night around them, "You found your place." "Yes," Benjamin said. "I was worried about you for a long time," Robert said, "all those years moving." "I was not unhappy," Benjamin said, "but I was not here yet." Robert was quiet for a moment. "She is remarkable," he said. Harriet, she is the kind of person who makes you want to be more careful and more thorough. Benjamin smiled in the dark. Yes, he said, that is exactly right. Robert left the next morning with the small wooden horse tucked in the saddlebag of the recipient, who was 4 months old and could not yet appreciate it, but who would, and with an open invitation to return that was issued by both of them and genuinely meant. The years on the Cimarron accumulated with the particular quality of good time, full and specific, and not running away from them. Thomas walked at 11 months and talked incessantly from the moment he began, and learned everything about the property with the same systematic curiosity his mother brought to things, following Benjamin through the south pasture and asking the names of things and why they did what they did. Benjamin answered every question with the seriousness the questions deserved, because he had been answered seriously himself as a child and understood what it did for a person. Harriet's correspondence with Kansas State continued and expanded, and in 1885 Professor Garrett visited the property in person, a bespectacled, enthusiastic man who spent 2 days in the fields with Harriet walking through the methodology, and then sat at the kitchen table for an entire evening talking about agricultural science, while Benjamin fed Thomas and kept the stove going, and listened with the satisfaction of a man watching something he had always believed in being exactly as good as he thought it was. The cattle operation grew to 50 animals by 1886, and they had built a second barn and hired Samuel permanently, and the young man had grown into his competence and was reliable and good, and sometimes brought his younger sister on Saturdays, a quiet girl of about 13 named Clara, who had a natural way with the horses that Benjamin noticed and mentioned to Harriet, who agreed and began quietly teaching her. Their second child came in the spring of 1886, a girl they named Frances Ruth, Frances for nobody in particular, but because it sounded like someone worth becoming, and Ruth for Benjamin's mother. Frances had Harriet's dark hair and her father's stubbornness, and a laugh that began almost immediately after birth, and did not seem to plan on stopping, and Thomas regarded her for the first week with the philosophical resignation of someone who has been presented with a significant change to the established order, and is finding the best way to accommodate it. By the second week, he had appointed himself her primary guardian, and could be found sitting beside her at every opportunity, a position he maintained with devoted seriousness for the remainder of his childhood. In the summer of that year, Benjamin rode to Caldwell and stood for a while outside the Silver Fork saloon, not going in but just standing in the evening light on the familiar wooden sidewalk. He was 32 years old. He had come here 4 years before as a trail-worn cowboy heading for Wichita, had heard a name he had no reason to know, and had turned around and ridden through the night because something in him that he had not consulted had decided there was something he needed to do. He thought about the 2 men at the bar whose conversation he had overheard. He did not know where the tall one with the brass-button vest had gone. He did not know and did not particularly care. He thought about Gerald Fitch in his wire-rimmed spectacles and hoped the man was well. He thought about Marcus Hale and wished he were alive to see how things had turned out. He went inside the Silver Fork and ordered coffee and sat at the bar and drank it slowly, the way he had on the July night 4 years ago, and the piano player worked through something in the corner, and the smell of tobacco was the same, and he felt the very pleasant sensation of being a man who has returned to a place from a considerably better position than the one he last occupied in it. The barman was the same square-built man with the gray mustache. He looked at Benjamin for a moment, and then his eyebrows went up. "The man who asked about the Hadley property," he said. "Yes," Benjamin said. "Word got around that it worked out," the barman said, setting down the coffee cup he had been wiping. "The hearing." "It did. You stayed," the barman said, not quite as a question. "I did," Benjamin said. "We are out on the Cimarron, 300 acres and growing." The barman looked at him with the expression of a man who has seen a lot pass through a saloon and knows when something has come out right. "Glad to hear it," he said. "She is a good woman." "She is the best person I have ever known," Benjamin said with the plain directness of absolute conviction. The barman nodded once, as if this had confirmed something. "Another coffee, please," Benjamin said. He rode home in the long summer evening, through the flat golden land with the light going sideways across the wheat fields and the cottonwoods along the Cimarron standing in their full summer weight of green. He rode Rosalind, who was 8 years old now and had not slowed down particularly, still carrying him with that particular quality of smooth, willing motion that had always made her the best horse he had ever owned. He talked to her the way he always did, and she flickered an ear back at him to indicate she was listening, and the road turned south and he crested the low rise and there was the house, the cottonwood log walls gone silver with years, the kitchen garden full and bordered by stones, the new barn standing solid behind the old one, the fields spreading south and east in the evening gold. He could see Harriet on the porch and Thomas beside her, and he could hear, even from the rise, the particular sound of Francis's laugh. He stopped Rosalind on the crest and looked at it all for a moment, the way you look at something when you understand what it is and what it is worth, the way you do when you are a man who came from moving and has arrived at stillness and knows the difference and is grateful for it with every particular of himself. He rode down the rise and tied Rosalind at the rail and went up the porch steps, and Thomas, who was 3 years old and had perfected the running approach, attached himself to Benjamin's leg with both arms and said something rapid and important about a grasshopper he had found and the nature of its opinions, and Benjamin picked him up and carried him, and listened to the grasshopper report with full seriousness. Harriet was standing at the porch rail looking at the evening fields, Francis on her hip, her dark hair loose in the evening breeze, the ring on her hand catching the last of the light. She turned when he came up beside her, and the look she gave him was the look he had been learning for 4 years and still found new things in, warm and direct and entirely his. "How was Caldwell?" she asked. "Unchanged," he said. "Good. The barman, the same. He said he was glad it worked out." She turned back to the fields. "It did work out rather well," she said in the dry, precise tone that had the warmth underneath it. "Rather well," he agreed. Francis reached out one small hand and grabbed a fistful of his shirt with the decisive authority she brought to all physical interactions, and Thomas was still explaining about the grasshopper, and the evening light was going amber over the wheat, and the Cimarron made its quiet sound below the southern tree line, and the land was solid and honest beneath them, the way her father had always said it was. They stood on the porch as the light faded and the first stars came through, and the night settled over the Kansas plain with the summer warmth that held in the air long after dark, and the life they had built together was around them and complete, and there was nothing unfinished in it, nothing uncertain, only the good continuing weight of days that were full and honest in theirs. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and Thomas told the grasshopper story one more time with new details, and Francis fell asleep against Harriet's shoulder with the total commitment of small children to unconsciousness, and the stars came out thick and brilliant above the flat land that stretched to every horizon. It was, Benjamin Keating thought, exactly what he had not known to hope for, and exactly what he would not have traded for anything the world had ever offered him or was likely to. He had ridden through the dark on a July night for a woman he had never met, following nothing more substantial than the sense that something wrong was happening to someone who had not done anything to deserve it. He had arrived at dawn with his hands up and his intentions plain, and what had met him was not what he expected, and more than he had known to want, and the 14 miles between a saloon conversation and a low rise above a cottonwood log house on the Cimarron had turned out to be the most important ride of his life. He tightened his arm around Harriet, and she tilted her head up and looked at him in the starlight with those amber-dark eyes, and he looked back at her, and no words were needed for what passed between them, because they had been building the language of it together for 4 years and had gotten it, by this point, very right. The Kansas night held them, and the land held them, and the house stood solid at their backs, and the stars above the plain were the same stars that had lit the road on that July night when a tired cowboy had made a decision that changed everything. And they were, if anything, even more brilliant for being looked at from a place called home.